Good afternoon to all of you. I thank the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project for inviting me to deliver this lecture on denotified tribes and the criminal justice system today, which is a momentous date in the calendar of Indian legal history because it marks the date of repeal of the Criminal Tribes Act, commonly referred to as the CTA. Nehru famously declared on 15th August 1947 that at the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world slept, India awoke to life and freedom. But this was not true for all its people. This date has been adopted as Vimukta Day to symbolize that denotified and nomadic communities gained independence, at least legally, only 5 years later on 31st August 1952 with the repeal of the CTA, and to expressly acknowledge that there is much more to be done for it to translate to freedom and equality in the real sense for these communities. I will today speak broadly on the disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system on denotified tribes with a focus on the historical context that has in turn shaped the present scenario, whether it is casteist stereotypes and societal attitudes, police discretion or its use, or enactment of special laws itself that affect the livelihood of these communities. While my speech primarily deals with denotified tribes relating to the CTA, it should be noted that in conversations on reform and welfare, they are often grouped together collectively as denotified tribes, which consists of denotified tribes, nomadic tribes, and semi nomadic tribes. It is pertinent also to point out that while almost all denotified tribes were or continue to be nomadic in nature, all nomadic communities were not necessarily notified as criminals under the CTA. So treating them as a homogeneous group has its own perils, which I can't delve into at the moment but want to flag before I begin. Legal historians and scholars have researched colonial records extensively and pointed to a myriad of factors that prompted the passage of the CTA, a Consolidated Criminal Tribes Act of 1924. Some of these factors, which were subject of much debate, include the aftermath of the 1857 mutiny, in which some of these notified tribes had participated, after which the British thought to implement the divide and rule policy as a means of social and political control. Infrastructure of railways, roads, etc., which were built to increase revenues and private business interests, but also resulted naturally in the increase in settled populations, rendering these nomadic traders, transporters, etc., rather redundant. This had the unintended effect of leaving members of these communities vulnerable to criminal activity for sustenance. The CTA framework also drew parallels to dacoits referred to as thugs or thuggy, and reiterated attributes of violence to these nomadic communities, assimilating the public's existing fears. This in turn was the justification for special police powers, increased surveillance, reporting obligations on locals, different standards of evidence, etc., which were features in the Thuggy campaign in the 1830s as well. The Criminal Tribes Act sought to suppress what the British termed as predatory castes, who were quote unquote hereditary criminals, that is, criminals by birth. The attraction of suppressing certain communities was not unique to India. In fact, it mirrored a growth in such policies back in England as well. The belief that crime and propensity to commit it was genetic gained prominence under the garb of science with the rise of eugenics that, as we know, continued to escalate till the 1950s with the Second World War. Hereditary criminal class captured the attention of policymakers because it provided a rather neat justification for mass surveillance, wide discretion, and excessive use of force and power. The late 1800s in England was marred by high employment, poverty, alcoholism, etc., making it even more attractive to focus on crime and to explain it as a hereditary trait which required biological re engineering rather than addressing social, economic, or political factors. The net result was the othering of an entire set of people. In India, rather than relying on genetics and developing and devolving into biological determinism, colonial administrators saw crime as a profession passed across generations as hereditary. This is because they saw criminality through the prism of the caste system and interpreted crime to be an inheritable occupation passed across generations as was observed of any other profession, traders, agriculturists, artisans, etc. Coercive measures that focused on segregation, exclusion, and resettlement were thus aimed towards indigenous tribal communities and nomadic groups, dramatically increasing under the Thuggy Department and later through the CTA framework. Strong emphasis was placed on their so-called ritualistic traditions and nomadic lifestyle that did not fit in mainstream understanding to draw binaries between what was barbaric or primitive, that is, from whom protection was needed, and who was civilized and hence in need of protection. Reliance on a formula of stereotypes as a sure short way to firstly identify certain communities and then other them was the modus operandi. What is perhaps most disconcerting and ironic even is that the denotified tribes were historically communities that fell outside the scope of hierarchical caste structure that pervaded and continues to pervade Indian society. Yet, it is for specifically this reason that they fell outside the known framework or structure, and colonial officers and policymakers criminalized their identity merely based on caste itself. It is apparent that this is yet another example of colonial codification of what it perceived to be an indigenous custom or practices, even though neither the nomadic communities themselves nor so quote and unquote Hindus, to distinguish the two, themselves may have seen the former to be part of the hierarchical system. The British certainly thought it appropriate to fit them within the framework. This meant that communities which were traditionally not members of mainstream society, unshackled by its restrictive norms of what is acceptable way of living, of what are acceptable ways of living, being eating, etc., and lived without the weight of a labeled identity, were now clubbed together into a homogeneous identities of caste that in turn rendered them vulnerable to criminal policing excesses sanctioned by law. The 5 features of note in the CTA framework that explains how it was a wide social control tool was: number 1, absence of a right to appeal; number 2, that the government was empowered to resettle those notified under it; number 3, the act obligated settled peasants to differentiate their own activity from those that were designated as criminals and criminalized failure of locals to pass on information; number 4, mobility restricted and governed by a system of passes with stringent punishment; and 5, arrests could be made by police officers and also headmen. The stigmatization, harassment, and vulnerability that this act laid the foundation for against nomadic and forest tribes, including nomadic communities of traders, artisans, etc., as we will see, has sentenced denotified communities into an enduring legacy of persecution over 150 years later. The drafting and adoption of the Constitution of India was a revolutionary exercise aimed at transforming Indian society. However, a quick look at the Constituent Assembly debates reveals that the members too were not immune to the prejudicial stereotypes that prevailed in society against DNTs. The opposition to speeches made by H.J. Khandekar on those concerns are sufficient illustrations. Mr. Khandekar, seemingly the sole voice of these concerns, as early as on 21st January 1947 itself, drew attention to criminal tribes as communities that were unfairly branded at birth, regardless of their involvement in criminal activity, and that the aims and objects of the Constitution must extend greater protection to them. In 1949, during the discussion on the freedom of speech and movement, Khandekar again highlighted the plight of the criminal tribes, only to be met by a clamor of disagreement. He noted that while untouchability and forced labor were to be specifically outlawed, the suffering of criminal tribes had not been addressed. Elaborating on forms of surveillance and policing targeted at them, he insisted that the CTA curtailed their right of movement and violated their fundamental rights, necessitating the repeal of the legislation itself. However, his appeals fell to deaf ears, resulting in the complete absence of protection towards DNT communities as a distinct category. That the Constitution is silent on protections aimed specifically at DNTs was studied and recorded by the National Commission for Denotified Nomadic and Semi-Nomadic Tribes, DCNDT, constituted in 2006. In 1952, when the Act was finally repealed as a result of mobilization and based upon the recommendations of the Government of Bombay, over 2 million persons were freed from the taint of presumed criminality overnight. However, merely a repeal of legislation without concerted effort to spread awareness within the state administration or society at large meant that there remained communities that society looked at with suspicion, regardless of whether there was a cause to be. So it's not surprising that, owing to public pressure, habitual offenders legislations were enacted soon thereafter in several states, and they were supplemented by numerous existing and new provisions in state enactments. These acts were based also on the logic that someone who commits repeated offenses is one who has the inherent tendency or propensity for crime and is thus dangerous to society. At the time of introduction of these enactments, the prevailing assumption was that individuals choose to be criminals and are people who deliberately forego the choice to be honest. These notions have certainly undergone dramatic change through decisions of courts, which demonstrates a shift towards seeing crime and criminals as a product of societal circumstances. However, this shift in approach has failed to percolate to the law enforcement personnel who rely on the concept of habitual offenders to routinely persecute already vulnerable and stigmatized denotified tribes. For these reasons, the communities failed to see any material changes in their own lives after the repeal of CTA, because the police and law enforcement agencies continued to knock at their door first upon hearing of the commission of any crime. The traditional occupations followed by members of DNTs are fast vanishing. This is largely in part also a consequence of legislations which may be rooted in social welfare but have completely opposite results for these communities. For instance, first one, let us consider the environmental laws. 20 years after the repeal of CTA, the long-awaited Wildlife Protection Act was passed in 1972. While the importance of preservation of our rich wildlife can never be undermined, the act was criticized for expecting tribal communities dependent on hunting to change century-old livelihood practices overnight. Barring an exception for scheduled tribes in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the Act provides limited exceptions to hunting, contingent upon the discretion of those in charge. Punishment for minor infractions, including a 3-year jail sentence, fine of Rs 25,000, and seizure of property used in commission of offence by the government. Analogies are also found in the Forest Conservation Act 1980 and the Environment Protection Act 1986 that stipulates a jail sentence of up to 5 years and a fine of Rs 1 lakh. At this stage, it is important to notice that There may be a need to protect certain species, but the livelihoods and food sources of these communities who have depended on forests for centuries also needs to be balanced. The outcome of these legislation without affording efficacious alternatives to dependent tribal communities is the repeated violation of the law, making members of such communities vulnerable to being classified as habitual offenders. Due to the lack of a centralized demographic analysis of such offenders, the exact figures of what percentage of those against whom FIRs are registered is unavailable, but several reports by accountability groups suggest that a disproportionate number of arrests made target such tribes. Once entangled in the system, it takes months to secure bail and at great expense, which chains them to the vicious cycle of debt for life. In the quest for scientific conservation of our environment, keeping the participation of tribal communities out of the equation renders undesirable consequences. For centuries, such communities have coexisted with the environment. The criminalization of their acts does not abate environmental concern to a large degree. What will is accountability from large corporations and entities that have indiscriminately polluted our environment and which are never prosecuted for fear of economic repercussions. It is ironic that entities that have damaged our natural resources beyond repair continuously somehow evade forms of censure or get away with it with very light sanctions. But the force of the law is exercised against individuals. It is obvious then that aspects of our system that allows for this kind of strange dichotomy to continue must be revised and corrected. The second is through the excise laws, local excise laws. The woes of tribals dwelling in cities seem to be no better. Generational inferior treatment of members of DNTs stigmatized them to the fringes of society. This prejudice is so grave that they were compelled to be hired only for the most despised activities, perhaps resulting in alcohol consumption, especially country-made liquor, which is cheap and that enables the user to perform what livelihood activities that others avoid. The perception perpetuated in society that alcoholism is a character trait associated with certain tribes fails to take into account that it is a consequence of actions of that very society which condemns it. The additional criminal linkage has left DNTs vulnerable to arbitrary arrests, as is evident from data. The disproportionate number of arrests of these people who consume, sometimes produce, or often work for others in country-made liquor and its segment, and the consequent application of excise laws with harsh penal results is a reality, and the states need to take active measures to mitigate these individuals who have no resources in defending themselves in long drawn-out legal processes to secure their release at unaffordable cost. Over-dependence on informers or mukbirs provides a convenient reason for exercise of discretion by the law enforcement agencies. There are instances where stock witnesses to a search and seizure operation are themselves members of targeted tribes with FIRs registered against them, involved in such an exercise for the favor of being released. A great number of such cases were registered during the lockdown, when members of these communities dependent on a daily wage were forced to flout norms in order to feed their families. In many ways, the understanding of what factors make a criminal that persists in Indian society is not much different from that in 19th century England. The differing notions of criminality in fast developing England during the time of industrialization were also facilitated by public interest in crime and its perpetrators, which were quick becoming the subjects of innumerable works of fiction and fact. Now just compare this with the media we consume every day. OTT platforms are flooded with media depictions of crime and criminality. Causes of crime were often attributed to drunkenness, increasing poverty, increasing prosperity, rapid urbanization, overcrowding of residential areas, universal decline in morals, unsettled family life, and increasing population, which are some of the factors that still prevail in the minds of both the institution, whether through lawmakers or even judges, and laypersons as alike. But in a system that persistently keeps DNTs in economic hardships and stigmatizes their traditional forms of occupation in the absence of concerted socio-economic assistance, this cycle self-perpetuates. Now, in such a background, it becomes clear that these communities are almost doomed to the cyclical fate of punishment once they are picked up for the first time, whether justifiably due to guilt or purely as a result of prejudice and harassment, no matter how petty or trivial the offense. Numerous commissions constituted have concluded with similar findings that these communities are among the most impoverished, disadvantaged, and stigmatized despite the repeal of the CTA in 1952. The UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, way back in 2007, had drawn international attention and expressed concern regarding continued stigmatization of denotified and nomadic communities under habitual offenders laws. And both the National Human Rights Commission in 2000 and the IDATE Commission in 2017 have recommended repeal of these laws on the ground that they have the scope of legalizing harassment of members of denotified tribes at the hands of prejudiced law enforcement and police authorities. Little, however, has been done. Unfortunately, unlike colonial administration, which relied heavily on documentation and archival efforts and based their policies on such exercises, for good or for worse, the stereotypes relating to denotified tribes and prejudicial treatment suffered by them is the subject of very limited contemporary empirical evidence, severely restricting the scope of reformative measures. The IDATE Commission in 2017 comprehensively prepared lists on the denotified, nomadic, and semi-nomadic communities that are not recipients of affirmative action under the constitutional mandate of SC, ST, and OBC to determine who within the identified 269 communities need to be considered for inclusion requires close scrutiny. The government has reportedly begun an ethnographical survey to study nuances of these communities. Recently, in April 2022, the Parliamentary Standing Committee noted that this was still pending and has asked the government for a fixed timeline for its completion. It is unfortunate that despite consistent conclusions from the national commissions, little has been done. The state has to be alerted to ensure that this ethnographical exercise is completed and should show a sense of urgency which leads to tangible policy measures that extend the benefit of affirmative action to the appropriate communities as well. In terms of suggestions, numerous have been made. For instance, I am told that members of the CPA itself have pointed out that since the National Crime Records Bureau prepares a detailed annual report detailing statistics of prisoners accused and convicted of crimes, it could be used to analyze the impact of the criminal system on the DNTs if data on caste was collected as a relevant field and perhaps warrants consideration. Similarly, in the absence of caste-specific demographics in the census, there is difficulty in assessing the necessity and extent of reform policies required for the betterment of these communities. However, collection of data relating to caste is a complex matter in Indian society, even contentious, and has to be done with utmost care and consideration. So that it can be used to facilitate welfare policies rather than offend the preambulatory principle of fraternity and cause more social divisions. One is reminded of what Ambedkar said on the eve of adoption of our constitution, that political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of its social democracy. What does social democracy mean? It means a way of life which now recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity as the principles of life. These principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity are not to be treated as separate items in a trinity. They form a union of trinity in the sense that to divorce one from the other is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. Liberty cannot be divorced from equality. Equality cannot be divorced from liberty, nor can liberty and equality be divorced from fraternity. Without equality, liberty would produce the supremacy of the few over the many. Equality without liberty would kill individual initiative. Without fraternity, liberty would produce the supremacy of the few over the many. Equality without liberty would kill individual initiative. Without fraternity, liberty and equality could not become a natural course of things. It would require a constable to enforce them. We must begin by acknowledging the fact that there is a complete absence of two things in Indian society. One of these is equality. On the social plane, we have in India a society based on the principle of graded inequality, in which there are some who have immense wealth as against many who live in abject poverty. On the 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we'll be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by the reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradiction? It is this value, this precept of our constitution, fraternity, which needs to be taught, practiced, and iterated again and again and again. Fraternal relationships are not confined to formal occasions when we celebrate an anniversary or some past event, but are daily interactions between each other as human beings at social, professional, and cultural levels. The idea of oneness and equality has to begin at homes, schools, and workplaces, where we recognize and afford the inherent dignity each person is entitled to, not only by ridding ourselves of prejudice, but by rather acknowledging their existence to ensure that it does not serve as an obstacle for anyone. All legislative guarantees will remain well intentioned exercises put down on paper unless a holistic attitudinal change is not brought forth. When people and casual derogatory statements attributing commissions of crimes to DNTs to deflect attention from glaring inefficiencies in governance, the cascading effect is inevitable. They reinforce societal prejudices, mobilize more vociferous and incorrect voices to dictate public discourse against the marginalized, and result in a collective step back for entire communities. At the receiving end are always individuals, denied opportunities to better their lives for no fault of theirs. Attitudinal changes require coordinated efforts in training and sensitization, especially of law enforcement personnel, and strict sanctions for engaging in discriminatory conduct. Constitutional guarantees include at the root of them non-discrimination under Article 15.1 and Article 17, which are applicable not just against the state, which percolate to changing societal attitudes of stigmatization when declining to provide housing, jobs, etc. In this regard, the consistent suggestion across decades, be it the NHRC report of 2000 or the IDATE Commission's recommendation to create a separate schedule for these DNT communities and extend the protection of prevention of atrocities against SC/ST Act, requires urgent consideration and appropriate action. I would consider it a success on my part If, as a consequence of today's event, more people are encouraged to read about DNTs in their lives from scholarly personal accounts and even the rich vernacular literature available, and not limit their exposure to solely what is depicted in the mainstream media, which often depends on not on actual rights and agency of members of DNTs, but falls into the trope of relying on generosity of people in position of power to liberate these communities from the shades of prejudice which entomb them. We must unlearn these prejudices, which date back to colonial times, that have seeped into Indian society on the back of the still immensely pervasive caste system, and encourage others to do that as well. All this must finally, and most importantly, be directed towards seeking accountability from the state, whether it is executive, legislative, or even the judiciary, to work actively towards fulfilling the constitutional mandate of equality, liberty, and fraternity, with special emphasis on DNT communities. Thank you.